Okay, here we go. How are you guys today? Doing all right? Good weekend? All right, glad to hear it. Were there any questions I could answer before we get started today? Lab due tonight, right? Okay, next lab's posted. You ought to at least be able to get a good chunk taken out of it just based on what we've already talked about, what we're going to talk about today. There are still a few things in it that may seem unexplained, but those are things that are coming up rapidly. So it won't be long. Probably by the end of the week we will have talked about just about everything you need to be able to do to get this next lab done. So don't worry too much if you see some things in there and you go, what? What's he talking about? We'll get there real soon. Right? So when we left off last time, we had started talking about associations. We had talked about one-to-one associations. We had created a employee model and an office model, and we had set up a one-to-one relationship between the two. Right? So we could see basically what it is that Rails does for us when we create those kinds of associations, which is most everything, and the few things that we have to do. Like, for example, in both of the models, we had to call the has1 method and tell it that they were related. We actually only had to do that on one side of the relationship. The other side had already been put in for us when we generated our migration. Right? And basically, once we had that done, we were able to create objects of either type, create employees, create offices. We could then take an office that we had created and we could assign it to an employee, or we could take an employee that we had created and we could assign it to an office. And we found that Rails had added methods to both classes for us. So from an employee, we could access all the data about their office. From an office, we could access all the data about the employee. And we were able to create employees based on offices and offices based on employees by using the build employee method that had been added to the office model and the build office method that had been added to the employee model. Did I say that right? Maybe. I might have just said the same thing 2 times. I'm not 100% sure. Right? Well, anyway, hopefully you know what I'm talking about. What we have to do today then is we want to go on and start talking about the collection type associations, the one-to-many and the many-to-many associations, the type where it's not just one object related to one other object, but instead one object related to many others, or occasionally many objects related to many others. Right? So let's dig into that. Sound okay? Starting off with one-to-many. I was thinking let's use the steps model that we were playing with last time. Remember, we created a steps model when we were talking about callbacks. Essentially, we had set it up so that every time a new step was created, a callback was used to automatically assign a position to the step before it actually got saved. Right? I actually had that work that we had done in a different Rails project, not in the relationship example project that we're in right now. So we might want to go ahead and just sort of regenerate what we had already done to a certain extent. So let me go ahead and recreate my, my step model, right? Just to kind of put us back to where we were before. I'm going to, on the command line, run Rails generate model. Okay. And I want to create a model for a step, and let's say every step has a title, which is a string, and a description, which is text. Oh, and the position, of course, which is an integer. There we go. I believe that's what we had last time, a title, a description, and a position. Right? So I'll go ahead and create my step model. What we had done when we had worked with the step model previously was we had then gone in and added a couple of methods to the step model, the step class, so that we could handle the automatic generation of the position number every time a new step was created. That is familiar, right? Did I dream that? We did that. Okay, just making sure. Never know what kind of funny things go on in my head, right? I'm not going to go back and I'm not going to put those in right now. Because basically what I want to do is, in addition to the step class that we have here, I also want to create a tutorial class. The way we did the steps last time was a bit bogus, if you think about it, because essentially we had set up a whole Rails application that could be nothing but a series of steps. I don't know, I guess, you know, in the right context that could potentially be useful, but in the idea that we were making steps for tutorials, like more than one tutorial, the way we had done it before wasn't going to work because there were no actual tutorials. There was nothing but a bunch of steps. So what I want to do in this case is I do want to actually create a tutorial model which we can then have be part of a one-to-many relationship with the steps themselves. So I'm going to do Rails generate model tutorial. And let's just say every tutorial has a title. That'll be enough for that. We could give lots of other details to a tutorial if we needed to, but a title should be sufficient. Okay. Now, if I was really and truly starting on this little idea from scratch, what I would have done was first generated the tutorial model the way I just did, and then after that come back and created the step model. And when I created the step model, I would have put in there that there's a tutorial that it references, kind of like last week when we said there was a, what was it, an employee that was referenced from the office or something along those lines. By putting in my step model that there's a tutorial that's referenced, what would have happened is ActiveRecord would have automatically set up the foreign key field for me. So every step record would have in it a tutorial ID field, which would have in it the ID of the tutorial that that particular step was a part of. Right? But I was kind of trying to take us back to where we were, which means I created the step first since we had already worked with the step class, and then I created the tutorial. And this is entirely something that could actually happen, where you create your models out of order, maybe not thinking ahead about what exactly it is you're going to need or not realizing at the time what you're going to need. But essentially right now we have the step model, we have the tutorial model, but we don't actually have a way to relate them. For them to be relatable, to be able to build an association between the two, there has to be a foreign key field somewhere. Right? And right now neither of these two classes, neither of these two tables have a place to store a foreign key. Right? So that's a third thing we're going to have to do here is add a field to be the foreign key. Since this is going to be a one-to-many relationship where one tutorial can have many steps, but each step relates to one tutorial, the actual foreign key field is going to have to be on the step side, the many side of the association. But since I've already created the step, I have to go back and add that field kind of pseudo-manually in a way. So what I might do is I might say Rails generate migration. Right? The model is already generated, so I don't need to generate the model again. I'm going to call my migration add tutorial ID to steps. And I'm going to tell it what I actually want to add is a field called tutorial underscore ID, and I want that to be an integer field. A little bit of ActiveRecord magic going on here in this command. Right? For starters, the name of the migration, add tutorial ID to steps. The first and the last word are kind of important. The fact that I put add first lets it know that we're adding something. That helps it make a good educated guess about writing the migration for me. Having steps, the name of a table, is the last word. Again, gives it a clue as to what table is being added to. Right? The middle part doesn't matter so much because the last argument that I give the command, where I actually give it the name of a field and a data type, basically takes the place of everything that's in the middle of the migration name. Right? But if I go ahead and hit enter, it should create my migration for me. And whenever I have it manually create migrations for me like I just did, I always like to go take a peek at them and just make sure it looks right. There it is. Add column to the steps table called tutorial ID that's an integer. Yep, that's exactly what I wanted. Okay. So at that point, what should happen is when we actually migrate our database, when we run rake db:/migrate, we should create a steps table that is not prepared to be part of a relationship. Then we create a tutorials table. Then we will add a field to the steps table so that it has a place to store a tutorials ID. Right? Then we just have a little bit more work to do to get those two to actually become part of a one-to-many association. Right? So let's see, I could go ahead and do rake db migrate status if I wanted to. Right. That shows which migrations have been run and which ones have not. You can see I have 3 down migrations, 3 pending migrations, right, which is exactly where it should be. If I go ahead and run rake db:/migrate, it'll run those migrations. Looks like all 3 of them succeeded. I don't see any error messages. Good with that? Okay. If I check my migration status again, looks like everything is up. So, fantastic. Okay. So from setting up an ActiveRecord, active model basis, right, getting the database caught up and prepared to be able to hold the data we need it to hold, I think we're pretty much there. Everything in that piece is done. Right? The next step then is if I come up and I look at the actual step model and the tutorial model, right? At the model level, kind of at the Ruby level if you want to think of it that way, I need to at this point let those 2 models know that they are related to one another so that Rails will add the proper methods to both of them so that I can access them in a Railsy sort of way, in an ActiveRecord sort of way. Right? So in tutorial, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a method called hasMany. I'm going to say a tutorial has many steps. Right? HasMany is just a handy little convenience method they give us that goes ahead and adds to this class methods that are going to be necessary in order to find and allow us to work with many steps that may be associated with the tutorial. Right? Notice the pluralization. Right? The actual name of the model is step, singular. But here, like we were talking about last time, you sort of follow the English-like convention. When we're talking about more than one of something, we pluralize it. So, which sounds better, hasMany step or hasMany steps? Well, hasMany steps is the way we would typically say that, and that's actually the way that Rails wants it. It wants that to be plural. Okay. So that's what we need to do on the tutorial side. Over on the step side, right, we need to let the steps know that they belong to a tutorial. The way we do that is a method called belongs_to. Okay. So I'll say a step belongs to a tutorial. Again, pluralization is important. Does it belong to a tutorials or belong to a tutorial? Well, in this case it's singular because we're indicating that it belongs to just one. Okay. We could of course go on with both of these 2 models. We could add validations if we wanted to. Okay. Maybe over with tutorial, for example, I'll go ahead and do that. Let me say validates that it has a title. We're going to check and make sure that its presence is true. Have to have a title. We could, of course, also come in and add custom methods, add callbacks. We'll do that in a minute. Here in a minute, we'll go back to the steps model. Well, actually, we'll have to go back to both in this case. Add some custom methods so that we can get our automatic step ordering to work again. But so far, is everything okay? All right. Let me jump out to the console and let's see what we've gotten for our trouble. There we go. If I take a look at tutorial, that's what it sees a tutorial as being. An ID, a title created at and updated at. If I take a look at a step, that's what a step looks like. ID, title, description, position, created at, updated at, and tutorial ID. So everything's there. Okay. Let's go ahead and make a tutorial. Right? I'm going to make a tutorial called cake. Right? I'm going to do tutorial.create, fastest way I know of to make a new object. That way we don't have to come back in a second step and save. I'm going to say this tutorial has the title Bake a Cake. I hit enter. It creates a new object for me, inserts its data into the database, and I now have a new tutorial called cake. If I say cake.title, I of course get back bake a cake. But what happens if I say cake.steps? Well, in that case, I got back an empty array. Right? What happens is on the side of the association where you say has many, so in this case, in the tutorial side of the relationship, that's what we're working with is a tutorial. Cake is a tutorial. We said in the model that cake has, or that a tutorial has many steps. What that method actually ends up doing for us is creating a method, several of them actually, but one of them is a method called steps. And whenever I call that steps method on a tutorial object in this case, it returns to me an array of all of the steps that belong to that particular, that are associated with that particular object. So all of the steps that are associated with the cake tutorial in this case. Right? It's plural, so it makes pretty good sense. Cake.steps returns multiple steps, or at least potentially could. It'll always return them as an array, which is why we got an empty array back here. Okay. We could do things like say cake.steps.size, since it is an array, and we can just get a count. Right? Actually calling count works just as well. So .size or .count on the end of the pluralized associated table name. Right? Will tell us how many of those things there are. Okay. And overall, the cake tutorial will get a lot more interesting if we actually add some steps to it. So let's add some steps. Let me make a step called, let's call it prep. I'm going to say create a new step. The step's going to have a title of preparation. Let's see, steps also had descriptions, right? So I'll say set a description of gather needed materials. Okay. Steps are also supposed to have a position, but I'm not going to mess with the position quite yet. I'll just leave it blank. I hit enter. New step is created. Step is stored or referenced through the prep variable. Right now this step has no position because I didn't assign one, and it also has no tutorial ID because it hasn't yet been assigned to a tutorial. Alright, so in this equation, I have a step called prep. I have a tutorial called cake that has no steps. Right? Steps is essentially an array of steps. If I wanted to assign the prep step to the cake tutorial, all I have to do is actually push that step into the steps array for the cake. So I could do .push, for example, but I like to use the less than push operator. Like that. Basically, I'll say into the steps for the cake tutorial, push in the prep step. This is getting real Dr. Seussy. I hit enter. It actually returns to me the step itself, and if I take a look over at the tutorial ID for the step, you see it's automatically been assigned. I didn't have to assign the ID manually. I just, in object terms, pushed one object into a subarray stored inside another object. ActiveRecord took care of figuring out what IDs needed to be done, wrote the SQL, and updated the database for me. So now, if I go to my cake tutorial, I call the steps method and I ask it to count them. It tells me there's now 1 step in this tutorial. If I just call the steps method directly, I can see an array of all the steps that are there. In this case, it's the one called preparation. Right? So we can add, or maybe add's not the right word, we can associate objects, right, one to another by simply creating the objects that can be associated and then just pushing one into the array of the other. It's basically what happened. Okay. There's another shortcut that's kind of nice, and that's that in addition to the steps method that was created for us automatically, the steps method itself also got a method called build. So if I say cake.steps.build, what I'm doing is essentially creating a new step, building a new step. This new step, though, that I'm building is going to be a step that right from the very beginning is going to be associated with this particular tutorial, the cake tutorial, since it's being called directly from the cake tutorial steps array. So if I wanted to make another step here, I'll say this new step has a title of mix. I'll say it has a description of mix the ingredients. And again, I'm not going to mess with the position. If I hit enter, new step was created. Has the right title, has the right description. Notice it also has the right tutorial ID. So calling the build method directly off of the tutorial steps array automatically associated this new step with that particular tutorial. Okay. One thing you might notice that it didn't do, though, I don't see any SQL written. I don't see that any database work happened. And sure enough, if I go to cake.steps, right, I see both of my steps in there. But notice the mix step doesn't have an ID, doesn't have created at or updated at values. Essentially, when I use the build method, the new step was created, was put into the cake's steps array, but it has not actually been saved to the database yet. Right? If I want to save it to the database, if I just save the tutorial itself, if I call cake.save, what will happen is if there have been any updates to the cake object, those will be saved, but it'll also go through any associated objects. So in this case, it'll go through the steps. So if there are any steps that haven't been saved, those will be saved as well. Basically, it'll save the entire sort of tree of related objects. So when I do cake.save, right, the main thing that actually happened there was saving that new step that I had built. So, pretty easy to access the objects that are associated with one another. Right? Pretty easy to create objects and put them together. Right? When I have a tutorial like cake, if I just call steps, it shows me all the steps that go with it. If I have a step like prep and I call tutorial on it, I can see the tutorial that goes with a particular step. So I can come at the association from either of the two sides, come at it from the one side or from the many side. Both of them work fine. If I already have a step created and I want to add it to an existing tutorial, I can just push it into the steps array of that tutorial. If I already have a tutorial and I want to create a new step specifically for that tutorial, I can call the build method on the steps array. Pretty okay. You want to make one more? Create one more step? Do you want to make the step first and then add it to the tutorial, or do you want to build it straight off the tutorial? Build it? Okay. So we could do cake.steps.build. Say this new steps title is going to be bake. The description can be put it in the oven. Oven, not over, oven. So this new step that will be created as a result of this statement will already have the ID for the cake tutorial in it because it's being built specifically for that tutorial. That's what the build method basically does for us. Convenient that way. But when we use the build method, it's not immediately saved. So we need to go back and save the tutorial. So cake.save, which will then also save all the associated steps. So then that step is available. It's stored in the database. Safe and sound. How about one more step? I'm going to make one last step called cool. This time I'm going to do it the other way. Step.create. I'm just going to create the step independent of any tutorial. I'll say this step has a title of cool, and its description is allow to cool. In this case, since I'm using the create method, the new step object will be created and saved. But it's not currently associated with any particular tutorial. If I wanted to associate it with the cake tutorial, then I could do cake.steps, push into it the cool step, which is my favorite step. How could you not like the cool step? I hit enter. That step's now been added as well. Alright, so if I go to my cake tutorial and I ask for all the steps, I can see them all in there. If I do cake.steps.count or cake.steps.size, I can see how many there are. That dark blue is hard to see up there on the screen, but it says 4, which would be correct. I could do things like, say, cake.steps.first.title. What's the title of the first step for baking a cake? Preparation. If I do cake.steps.last.description, the description of the last step of baking a cake, allow to cool, is what I get back. Once it's set up, it's awfully easy to work with. Very friendly. Let me make another step. Again, I'm going to create it independently. Let's make a step called Netflix. I'm going to say Netflix equals step.create. New step whose title is subscribe. And I'm going to set the description to subscribe to Netflix. There we go. That new step's created. Now that step I'm not going to assign to the cake tutorial because subscribing to Netflix has nothing to do with baking a cake, except it gives you something to do while the cake is baking, I guess. But it's not a mandatory step. It can be skipped. Right? If I wanted to see a list of all my steps, if I do step.all, just like before we started talking about associations, there's every step that's been created. 4 of them you can see are part of tutorial 1. 1 of them is not a part of any tutorial. What if I wanted to see a list of all of these steps that have an X in their title? Ooh, rats. Wait, only one of them does. Yeah, we could do R. Okay, so every... Yeah. The whole reason I picked that stupid Netflix thing was I was trying to think of something else with an X in it, and then I realized I didn't even put it in the title. Maybe I should just fix that. Yeah, why not? Right? How about I do this? Netflix, I still have the variable that references it. If I say netflix.updateAttributes, I'm going to say I want to update the title, and I want to change it to subscribe to Netflix. There we go. That updated the data. So now there should be 2 steps that have X in the title. How could I retrieve both of them? Well, remember our where method? I hope so. Spent a while talking about that guy. What if I say where title is like, and then what I want it to be like is some letters and X and some letters. There we go. I found 2 steps that matched that pattern. 2 steps that had an X in the title. What if I wanted to find all of the steps that have an X in the title and are part of the cake tutorial? Well, that could be more complicated if we wanted to make it that way. Right? I could do the same where clause that I just did, and then I could probably append another where clause onto the end of that, where I could do something like, say, where the tutorial ID is 1. But we don't have to make things that complicated. Most of the time in ActiveRecord, if you find yourself manually handling IDs and foreign key fields, you're probably doing it wrong, right? There's probably a way ActiveRecord has that work already basically done for you, right? Like in this case, if I wanted to find all of the steps that have an X in the title that belong to the cake tutorial, why should I start off by saying step.where and deal with every single step? Why not start off only dealing with the steps that are part of the cake tutorial? What if I did cake.steps.where, for example? And I'll say title is like contains an X. You see, that worked just as well as that longer statement I put together where I had 2 chained where clauses. But here, I only needed 1 where. The only difference was here I called it specifically on the steps array for a tutorial instead of just calling it randomly on all steps. So it made life a little easier, and you see I never had to touch an ID or mention a foreign key field. Like I said, most of the time if you run into those things, if you find yourself handling IDs and foreign keys, look around a little bit and see if maybe there isn't an easier way that ActiveRecord is going to let you do what you want to do. Okay. So all of those nice methods that we talked about earlier, where and order and conditions and all of those, remember those? Okay. Those are all going to be available to us on, what do you want to call them, sub-collections of objects through associations. Right? It's not anything we really had to worry about when we were talking about the one-to-one relationship. There's no searching or figuring out which office belongs to this employee. Either there's an office or there's not. That's it. But once we have these collection type associations, where a tutorial can have potentially many steps, all of those things that we had talked about before we started talking about associations, right? All those different handy little methods that ActiveRecord gave us, right, all still exist and can be used on the collections themselves. Okay? Let's go back and fix that position numbering thing, unless you have any questions. Alright, to get the automatic positioning numbering working again, I'm going to go over to the tutorial class, and I'm going to give it a method. I'm going to call it last position. So basically, oh, actually, no, that's right. I want it to be an instance method, because for any given tutorial, I want to be able to ask it what the last used position is. To get the last position, I can say for this tutorial, self, go through the steps array, put them into order by position, and give me the last one. So the array of all of these steps will be put into ascending numerical order based on their position. The last one will then be returned. If there is no last step, basically meaning the tutorial doesn't have any steps yet, okay, then we'll get nil back. Okay, won't be anything there. Okay. So let's say if there is a last step and that last step has a position, because it's possible, like in our case, maybe we created steps that don't have positions. So if we have a last step and the last step has a position, then let's return that value. If there is no last step or it doesn't have a position, then let's just return 0. That'll be the starting point for our numbering. So for any tutorial then, I can call last position, find out what the last used position number and all of its steps are. That's a little bit different than the way we did it last time. Last time we added last position to the step class itself because the steps weren't actually associated with a particular tutorial. There was just the steps, however many of them there happened to be. So the step class itself was perfectly capable of figuring out what the last used position was. But here, the last used position would be determined by which tutorial we're talking about. If I have 3 tutorials, there is no one universal last step. There's a last step available for each of the 3 tutorials. So that's how I set it up, why I set it up that way. If I jump back over to the step class then, I'm going to make a new method. I'm going to call it setPosition. I'm going to say for this tutorial, let's say if it's assigned to a tutorial, so if self.tutorial, and I guess if it doesn't already have a position, and if self.position is nil, Then what I'm going to do is I want to set this step's position to the value I get back when I call tutorial.lastPosition plus 1. So if I'm creating a new step, we call setPosition. That's the idea. Okay. If this new step knows who its tutorial is and doesn't already have an assigned position, then get the last position from its tutorial, add 1 to it, and make that the position. And then I could call this on a before save callback. So every time I go to save a step, it'll automatically call that method for me, set its position, and then save itself. Does that make sense? Do you have questions? Comments? Suggestions? It's too easy. Alright, well, let's try it out and see if it works. Instead of going back and messing with that cake tutorial, which has all those steps in it already that don't have positions, let me just start a fresh one so I don't have to go back and fix all those other ones up. I'm going to make a new tutorial. I'm going to call it the Rails tutorial. So new tutorial, I'm going to call it Learning Rails. There we go. Got my new Rails tutorial. Let's add some steps to the tutorial. I'll say rails.steps, hit enter. I can see that it has no steps currently. If I do rails.steps.build, I'll create a new step whose title is Learn Ruby. It's a good first step before you learn Rails. I'll set the body description. Didn't I call it description? Set the description to go learn Ruby. And I'm not going to assign a position to it because that should now happen automatically. I hit enter. I can see my new step. But why isn't the position there? Haven't saved it yet. Right. We told it to run the set position code before save. And when we create a new object using build, it's not automatically saved. We have to manually call save for it. Right? So if I go to my Rails tutorial and I call save, it'll save all the associated steps. If I then look at the steps that go with the Rails tutorial, uh-oh, there's still no position. I would have thought that would have done it. I think it tried. Looking at the SQL, I see select tutorials from tutorials where tutorials ID is 2, limit 1. Select all the steps from that particular tutorial. I think it was trying to figure out what the position number was right in there. But it never actually seemed to make it, did it? Yep, position ended up being nil. Well, that's not good.
Would you return 0 instead of just typing 0?
If it's the last thing in the method, it should return automatically. Let's try out that last position method. If I have a tutorial like my Rails tutorial and I call last position, right now it's giving me back 0, which is, I guess, correct considering that it hasn't put anything else in. Rails.steps, definitely nothing there. Step.all, definitely no position. Looks like the last position method works, as far as we can tell so far. What about set position for a step? Well, let's get a step. Let's say Rails step 1 equals. I'll go to my Rails tutorial. I'm going to go to its list of steps, and I'm going to pull out the first one. There's only one, so first and last would have been the same. If I then say Rails step 1, dot set position, I see a 1 was returned. Let's see, Rails step 1, but it's not actually there in position. Oh, you know what I did. Always forget the self. Yeah, otherwise position is just going to be a local variable. With that little change made, let me reload my console. Let me grab that first step again. Actually, I probably don't even need to bother, actually. Let me do Rails equals retrieve the tutorial where the title is like Rails. There we go. So in the Rails variable, I now have my Rails tutorial. Take a look at the steps for the Rails tutorial. Uh-oh. Oh, I've got an active relation. See that error? That's one you'll run into once in a while. ActiveRecord can be a little bit tricky in this way. It has a couple of different things that all sort of express themselves the same way, so it's easy to forget exactly what you're working with. Right? I've got this thing called Rails. Right? If I just kind of type it and see the output from it, what it contains, it looks like it's actually an object, real live object there. Right? But if I actually try and do something with it, like I did up at the top, Rails.steps, it comes back and says there's no such things as steps for an ActiveRecord relation. Right? An ActiveRecord relation has to do with lazy loading, they call it. Basically what will happen is ActiveRecord will wait until the very last moment that it can before it actually ever goes and queries the database. Until that point, if it can just fake it and pretend, right? Basically until it gets to a point where it thinks there's no other way to be able to do what it needs to do other than actually hitting the database, right? Then it will wait until that time, and it'll just use these relation things. Right? So like if I said, give me all the tutorials where the title is like Rails, and it gave me something back, and then on that something back I said, give me all of them that have an ID number that's greater than 50. Right? It would say, okay, yeah, sure, we can do that. Right? But really what it's doing all that time is just working off sort of a cache set of data. It's not actually hitting the database if it can avoid it. It's not until I really make it clear that I actually want a real object. And usually the best way to do that is to put .all or .first or .last on the end of whatever you're doing. When you get down to that point where you're asking specifically for all of them, the first one, the last one, right, that's when ActiveRecord finally will break down, go ahead and do the actual query and get you your real data back.
So before you're kind of working out of the view that the biggest view that you last
Yeah,
queried,
essentially.
so you're not actually getting.
Yeah, it kind of has like this cache set of the data. So when I did that line down there at the bottom, I did that a minute ago, tutorial where title is like Rails, right? It didn't actually go and pull out all the actual data from the database. It has obviously access to something. It was able to show me something there and make me think I had a real ActiveRecord object, right? But what I actually had there was not an ActiveRecord object at all, right? It's an ActiveRecord relation object. If I go back and I do that same query, but I put .first at the end of it, right, give me back the first record that actually matches this. Right? Just at a glance, it looks like it did the exact same thing. But if I go and I take a look at the class, look, it's not just a relation object now. It's an actual honest-to-goodness tutorial object at that point. Everything was just being sort of faked up until then. Good for efficiency, but can snag you out every once in a while. Okay? So throwing .first at the end of that where method call ended up getting me the actual tutorial I wanted. Okay? And what I wanted to do with it was I wanted to be able to look at its steps. So there they are. Right? So then if I go to the first step and I call set position on it, right? So rails.steps.first.setPosition. I'm also going to do rails.save to make sure that position is saved. Looks like it probably went ahead and saved it actually. If I now look at that tutorial steps, the first one has position of 1, like it's supposed to. So hopefully we got that little bug fixed. Okay. Let's try adding another step to the Rails tutorial and see if it comes out right with step number 2, or with position number 2. I'll do rails.steps.build, a step that has a title of learn ActiveRecord, description of learn about ActiveRecord. No position assigned yet because that's because it hasn't been saved. If I tell it to save the Rails tutorial, it saves that step. And if I then look at the steps for the Rails tutorial, position 1 can't have 2 position 1s. Now, what in the world made it do that?
In the set position you made it, it only does it if it's nil.
Right.
But conditions are bad.
But in the new step I just created, the Learn ActiveRecord step, it was nil. I didn't assign one. So it should have been. It did seem to trigger, but it just assigned the wrong position.
Should you add self to last position in the tutorials class?
You want to set the current position.
Should be self.last position.
Self.last.position? Oh no, because last is just a local variable. That's last right there. So no self in front of that. It's not an attribute of the model. I don't know. Let's see. If we go to Rails and we call last position, saying the last used position is 1, based on what it knows. That does seem to be correct. If I retrieve step 2, which I could get by doing rails.steps.last, I've got step 2 there. If I call 2.setPosition, it actually came back and said nil. That's curious. Well, maybe it's not. The return value of that if statement, well, that should have been this, shouldn't it? Still showing position 1 there. What have I goofed up? Oh, it is nil because it already has a position. So when I call set position, position's not nil. But that's the last thing checked, so that's the value that's returned. So let's say if we did 2.position equals nil. Let's wipe out the position that's already there. And then let me save 2. Take a look at 2 again. That time it got the correct position. We haven't changed or fixed anything, so there's no reason to assume that if we try and create another step, it'll work correctly. It's got to be something about the time that it happened, doesn't it? Because it seems to work when I call it later, like when I just now called it. Maybe it has to do with, does it have a tutorial yet? Because the step has to have a tutorial. But if it hasn't been saved yet, does it have a tutorial? If we're doing build, it does assign the tutorial ID before it ever does save, so that's probably not it. It's funny, I've done this like 20 times, and I don't remember it ever misbehaving in quite this way before. Let's try adding another step and see what happens. Let's do rails.steps. Actually, what do we have? Yep, we've got step 1 and 2. Rails.steps.build. Title is Learn More ActiveRecord. Description, Learn Advanced Stuff. Cross your fingers. No position yet because it hasn't been saved. Rails.save. Oh, it did work that time. Curiouser and curiouser. Rails.steps. You know how when we created the first step, it didn't create the position at all, it was nil? Okay. And then I manually went and put in the position, essentially, triggered the creation of the first one's position. Then when we created the second one, it acted like the first one had never been given a position. It started off at 0. I wonder if there was something in there that needed to be reloaded or refreshed. I should have reloaded my console at that point to make sure I actually was seeing what was really there. Because now it seems to be working, which is good because I can't figure out why it wouldn't at this point. I found the one mistake, the leaving off the self dot in that one spot. So, anyway, what we should do is we should wipe all these steps out and then start again from a brand new tutorial. But I think we'll move on. We'll create a couple more tutorials here in a bit, and hopefully if it is what I think it is, it ought to just keep right on working. I think we found the problem. It was just tricky to diagnose because there was something unrefreshed in there. All right, let's move on and talk about many-to-many relationships as much as we can in the time we have left. All right. You remember from database design, many-to-many relationships can't really exist in a relational database. You have to take a many-to-many relationship conceptually and you have to break it down into multiple one-to-many relationships with some kind of linking table between them. Right? Same exact thing, of course, is going to be true in Rails. There is no magic that can make a many-to-many relationship work in a Rails accessed database that wouldn't work in any other relational database. But Rails does have some neat tricks that once we get past the setup of it, can, from the object point of view, make it feel like it is a true many-to-many relationship, which is kind of cool, right? Traditionally, Rails has had two different ways to set up many-to-many relationships. One of them is called a has and belongs to many relationship. The other one is called a has many through relationship. Basically, the differences between them is that in a has and belongs to many relationship, the linking table that has to be in the database is something that you more or less have to create manually. We can still create it using a migration, but it has no model representation. So in a has and belongs to many relationship, there is a linking table, but if you don't go look at the database, you would never know it's there. There is no ActiveRecord model that pairs with the linking table when you're doing has and belongs to many, right? I also may be off on this, but I swear I remember reading that Rails was deprecating has and belongs to many relationships, right? They're not the preferred way of setting up many-to-many relationships nowadays, and I think they're going away. It's entirely possible, given how long it's been since I've used them, that we might try it and they might have already gone away and I just haven't realized it. But we'll go ahead and give it a shot either way. Okay? But in addition to the has and belongs to many type of many-to-many relationship, Rails also supports a has many through. Right? Has many through, basically what happens with it is that the linking table is also a model, is really kind of what it boils down to. Right? So when you use has and belongs to many, there are 3 tables in the database, but only 2 models. Right? The linking table has no model. When you do a has many through many-to-many relationship, there are 3 tables in the database and 3 models. There's a model to access all 3 of the tables, including the linking table. Okay? It used to be that if you were in a situation where the linking table required nothing but the foreign keys for linking the 2 tables, you would use has and belongs to many. Or if the linking table would have additional data stored in it beyond just the foreign keys for linking the tables, then you would use has many through. Nowadays, pretty much you just use has many through no matter what. Okay? So that's the basic idea. Let's try a has and belongs to many relationship and see if it works. Okay? Let's relate courses and tutorials. We've already got tutorials. Right? Let's make a courses model. And we'll say that a course can have many tutorials, and a tutorial can be used in many different courses. So many-to-many relationship. Let me jump out of the console here. I'm going to run Rails G model. I want to create a course model. I'll say every course has a title. Let's say every course has a discipline, C-I-P-L-I-N-E. Discipline, I think that's right. Okay. Let's say every course has a number, course number. It's not actually going to be a number, ironically enough. It'll be a string. Okay. And let's say every course has a number of credits that it's worth. Let's make that an integer. That's the only thing in that whole batch that we would potentially do any math on. What I'm thinking, of course, is every course has a title, like Rails, a discipline like CSYS, a number like 2863, right? And then a number of credits, like 3. Okay. So this will go ahead and create my course model. Okay. I can do rakedb migrate to go ahead and migrate my database, get that course database laid down, that course table laid down. Okay. So at that point, I have my tutorial model, I have my course model. Okay. If I want to hook those two together, associate those two in a many-to-many relationship, I need a linking table to go between them. right? If we're going to do has and belongs to many, since there is no model representation for that linking table, we just need to create the table itself. We could just go straight to the database and do it by hand with SQL. But of course then, if we were sharing with anybody else, working on the project with anybody else, that would kind of leave them out of the loop. So the best way to do this would be to generate a migration. So let me do Rails generate migration. That's right. Let's see, I'll call it course tutorial linking table. Usually in the past when I've done migrations, I've put something after the name of the migration, telling it what fields I wanted to add, for example. But here, essentially, we just have to write the migration ourselves. It's not that hard thing to do. The syntax for writing migrations is relatively simple, and you, of course, have all the other migrations that ActiveRecord has put together for you automatically that you can always go and look at. For our case, in our new migration file that was generated, okay, inside the up method, we can just tell it we want to create a table. The table in this case is going to have to be courses tutorials. The way this works in has and belongs to many, many-to-many relationships is that the linking table has to combine together the names of the two tables that are being linked in alphabetical order. So this linking table is supposed to connect the courses table and the tutorials table, put those in alphabetical order. That gives you what the table name has to be, right? Courses underscore tutorials. Okay. I'm also going to put in here ID false. That essentially tells it that the records in this table do not require an ID, don't automatically generate them. Okay. And then that's going to have a block that will go along with it, yielding a variable t, which is the table itself. Okay. Then I can say in the table, create an integer field called course ID. That's going to be the foreign key field that will hold the course ID. I'm also going to say then create a tutorial ID field, again an integer for holding the foreign key. And that's really all the linking table should require. No ID of its own. Its only purpose is to match up course IDs with tutorial IDs to act as a linking table in a many-to-many relationship. In the down method then, I just need to tell it how to undo what was done up there in the up method. In this case, I would just tell it to drop table called courses tutorials. So when we're migrating forward, we create the table. When we're rolling back, we're dropping the table. Starting to run out of time, let me jump over to the console here. I'm going to do rake db migrate. That applied my new migration, creating the linking table. And if I jump into the console, oh wait, can't jump into the console quite yet. Right. What I need to do is I need to open my course class. And in my course class, I'm going to say a course has and belongs to many tutorials. And over in my tutorial class, I'm going to say a tutorial has and belongs to many courses. So mirror images of one another, basically. There was never any mention in here of the courses tutorials linking table. As long as the courses tutorials linking table was named properly, right, then ActiveRecord should automatically figure out that that should be the name of the table. That should be the table that's used to link these two models together. Let's see if it worked. Crails. Let me start up the console. I'm happy to see that there were no explosions, no fire. So let's see, if I grab a tutorial, let me say Rails equals tutorial.last. So I have access to my Rails tutorial there. If I say Rails.courses, I get back an empty array. The SQL, select all the courses from courses, doing an inner join through the courses tutorials table, where it's looking for courses ID is equal to courses tutorials course ID. So it's building up the join that's necessary in order to link through that linking table. Looks like it's doing it correctly at this point. Okay. Let me make a course. Let's build a course. Okay. Let's have the Rails course. Let me say Rails equals. I'm replacing that variable I already have. Actually, let me say Rails underscore C. That's going to be the Rails course. And we'll say course.create. Okay. Let's say the course has the title of Rails. We'll say it has the, what else do we have? Discipline. I think that's right. The discipline of CSYS. We'll say it has the number of 2863. And we'll say it's worth, its credits are 3. That creates a new course. So now I have a Rails course and a Rails tutorial. Rails C, which is my Rails course. If I ask for its tutorials, I get an empty array. For the Rails tutorial, if I ask for its courses, I get an empty array. If I say to the Rails course, in your list of tutorials, push in the Rails tutorial, you can see from the SQL what it did was it inserted one record into the linking table, into the courses tutorials table, which was the ID of the course and the tutorial that we just asked to have associated with one another. So it looks good. At least for the moment, it looks like has and belongs to many still works. If I go to my Rails course now, and I ask for its tutorials, there's the Learning Rails tutorial. If I go to the Rails tutorial and I ask what courses it's used in, nothing shows up. Right? That's probably a case where it just needs to be reloaded. Let me say Rails.reload. Reload the Rails tutorial from the information that's currently in the database. Now if I say Rails tutorial, what are your courses? Yep. It says I'm used in the Rails course. So the relationship works. When we've got these many-to-many relationships, whether it's going to be through has and belongs to many or the other type that we'll talk about next time, has many through, right? Basically everything we could do with the one-to-many relationship on the many side, right, where we have the sub-collection of objects that are available, in a many-to-many relationship, we're able to do that from both sides. So tutorials have a subarray of courses that they belong to. Courses have a subarray of tutorials that are used. Right? We can use where methods, order methods, any of those different things we might happen to need are all going to be available. Right? Same things we have available for any of our different collections. Okay. That's probably where we'll stop. Maybe when we pick up again on, what day is today? Tuesday. On Thursday. When we pick up again on Thursday, maybe we'll create some more tutorials, create some more courses. Right now we have one course related to one tutorial. We need to do some cross-linking, sort of. Create some tutorials to go with multiple courses, create some courses that use multiple tutorials, just to make sure everything here is working as it should. But that'll give us a chance to practice with this stuff a little bit more. And then we will go on and talk about the has many through style of many-to-many relationship. Okay? Which will then mean we've covered the three basic types, one-to-many, one-to-one, and many-to-many. Okay? And we'll be able to start poking our noses into some of the weirder corners of things we can do with this, doing custom associations, table inheritance, and things like that. Okay? Do you have any questions? All right. Hope you have a good afternoon. I'll see you Thursday.
I have one on installing Ruby.